of the Pro Humanitate Institute. I have a couple of tasks this evening. The first is to thank all of you for taking the time to come out this evening. Greatly appreciate you taking the time. The second is to thank everyone who has made this evening possible, starting with the financial support of the Office of the Provost and the Rethinking Community initiative. I also want to thank our student government. Our student government is particularly helpful after the panel this evening. We will engage in a series of dialogue sessions, and our student government has been helpful in making sure that those dialogue sessions will happen this evening. Also, our Humanities Institute, who were our co-sponsors for the teach-ins that happened earlier this week. And thank you to everybody who took part in the teach-ins. Also, the College Democrats, the College Republicans, the Arch Society, OLAS, Black Student Alliance, Interfraternity Council, and the Wake Forest Review, all of whom are co-sponsoring this evening's event. I want to say thank you to all of those organizations. I also want to say thank you to some of the folks within PHI, our new executive director of the Pro Humanitate Institute, Marianne Majuka. I also want to say thank you to, where is she? Where is Shelley Sizemore? Who is there she is, our director of academic and community engagement. Shelley put together all of those teach-ins, which were, look, let me tell you, especially for community members, really are going to spare you the most nerdy aspects that could have squished out of all the corners tonight had we not had a chance to get some of it out of our system. There was a PowerPoint, though, that almost did happen. You can see me holding it in my hand, and I am going to do at least a little bit of it. Because I do want to spend just a moment providing a little bit of framing before I bring our distinguished panelist up. Because what happened in Charlottesville in August was both personally and politically excruciating. I spent my youngest years in Charlottesville, Virginia. I moved there when I was 3 years old because my father was taking on the role of being the first Dean of African American Affairs at the University of Virginia. We had a long family history there, my father and his twin brother having grown up in Richmond, Virginia in the Jim Crow public schools, and his twin brother having attended the University of Virginia from 1960 to 1964. It is a bizarre experience to watch the city you grow up in turn from Charlottesville to #Charlottesville. So we promised in this panel to talk to you a little bit about how did we get here and what does it mean for us. So in planning this, we had a lot of conversation about that framing. What does it mean to say us? Who are we leaving out when we say us? To say, what does it mean for us? How did we get here? That question, how did we get here, was asked on August 10th by the Daily Progress. That's the local paper in Charlottesville, Virginia. They asked that question on August 10th, how did we get here? On August 10th, no tiki torches had been lit yet. On August 10th, Heather Heyer was still alive. But the Daily Progress asked, how did we get here? And their answer was mostly that we'd gotten here to this place of civil unrest, they called it, in our town that is both progressive and quaint, quote, because of a city council person who they saw as having thrown matches in this space that I remember very well as Lee Park. Lee Park. I mean, I do remember Lee Park. It's funny to me now that they call it Emancipation Park. I mean, it's actually funny. But it strikes me as odd to imagine that we could possibly have gotten here by something as recent as anything that could have happened in 2017. So I'm going to just maybe push us back a little bit. How did we get here? Why would the city council in Charlottesville have even been discussing removing the statue in what was Lee Park and is now Emancipation Park? Well, you will remember that the last time that we gathered to have this kind of conversation here was after the death of 9 worshipers in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. You will recall that Dylan Roof in June of 2015 walked into Mother Emanuel, prayed with those 9 worshipers, then stood up and murdered them. And that when he was found just 2 hours from where we are right now in Shelby, North Carolina, he said, "I'm a white supremacist and I hope to start a race war with those murders." Instead, the Republican governor of South Carolina, with the bipartisan support of her entire state, brought down the Confederate flag on South Carolina government property. And we talked about it here in Waite Chapel. And we weren't the only people talking about it. Cities and towns all across the South started asking whether or not they had in their towns totems that might lead to that kind of violence. They started asking questions about it. Should we be thinking about Confederate symbols? It seems that at least part of how we got here has to be at least 2015, Dylan Roof. But even that seems far too contemporary. How did these symbols show up? When did they show up? When did we put up Confederate flags? And when did we put up statues to Robert E. Lee? I mean, it must have been right after the war, but it wasn't. There's a really great graph. I hate that I don't have my PowerPoint. Mostly we put them up at the turn of the century or in the 1950s. There's a big sort of blip in between 1901 and 1910, and then again in the 1950s. We made choices about when we put them up, and then we make political choices about when we may bring them down. But either way, it's got to be sooner than 2015. So then I started thinking about my uncle again. And I went back and I watched a video of my uncle talking about when he was the age of many of the young people in this room, 1960 to 1964, at college, the University of Virginia. So proud. And there were lit matches thrown at him for moving cars, lit cigarettes, and there were people who spit on him. And no one would room with him. My uncle's kind of a funny guy. He goes, "So, I got a single for, got to live by myself, double room." He says, "I never go back for homecomings because there's no one who would embrace me. But don't worry, it won't be like that anymore because we've changed who our campus is." And it breaks my heart to hear him say that, knowing what happens in 2017. How did we get here? So that's the question we're going to ask. We push back one more time because it's Mr. Jefferson's university who left us with an extraordinary legacy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What an extraordinary aspirational sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is Mr. Jefferson's university, the University of Virginia, where we hold these truths to be self-evident. It is also where he sat and wrote on the notes on the state of Virginia that it is quite clear that Black folks are made of something different. And both of those things have to be held in tension at the same time. We can no more throw out the Declaration of Independence than we can throw out the notes on the state of Virginia. We have to accept that they both are part of the legacy. So how did we get here? In a deep and complicated and long and fully American history that we are all taking part in at the same time. And so what I invite all of us to do is to investigate the hashtag Charlottesville inside of us. Not to assume that it's out there somewhere, up the road, but that we're taking part in it. We have a really great panel. I'm going to bring them out. And I'm going to ask them the questions, not because we want to ask them about their accountability, but because we want to ask ourselves about our accountability. How did we all get here? And even more importantly, where do we go from here? All right, let's bring them out. Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle Bouie is the senior political correspondent for Slate magazine. I want to tell you a little bit more about Jamelle. He is, in addition to being the chief political correspondent for Slate and a political analyst for CBS News, he is also a native of Virginia Beach, Virginia, and an alum of the University of Virginia, where he graduated with degrees in political and social thought and government. He also is quite an extraordinary chef, a very, very talented photographer, and he writes a tiny letter that I read religiously. He introduces me all the time to new writers and to new recipes. Michael Brendan Dodery is the senior writer at the National Review. Michael is also the founder and editor of The Slurve, which is a great newsletter on sports. And I have to say, one of the things that Michael did today that just puts him in my book of favorite people is that he met with a group of students. I always like to say people who are good to my students are they're in my book of happy people forever. And so he met with the Wake Forest Review earlier today, and I sent him an email and said, oh my God, they have to meet with liberal me all the time. Take pity and give them a chance to have a conversation. Michael Signer is an author, an attorney, and a lecturer at the University of Virginia. I like to say that Mike is very brave. Because Mike is a Madison scholar at the University of Virginia. Nobody studies Madison at Mr. Jefferson's University. Mike is also a member of the City Council in Charlottesville and currently serves as the mayor in Charlottesville. I do want to explain that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, all cities are governed with a system that has a city council that chooses a mayor out of the city council, but they also have a system that has a city manager. And so just so that you understand, the system is somewhat different than how it works in North Carolina. So it's also important to know that Mike is here and speaking not on behalf of the entire city council and on behalf of the entire city, but as himself. So just for your awareness. Rashad Robinson is Executive Director of Color of Change. Rashad is basically my favorite badass activist. I have learned over the years so much from Rashad and how to transform ideas into real-world strategy. What Rashad has done with Color of Change over the course of his tenure as executive director is extraordinary. If you lean even vaguely to the left and have anything like an email account, even if it has an AOL at the end, then you know Color of Change and their work, and you know how incredibly speedy they are in response to anything that smacks of injustice. And finally, our surprise guest, who was added to the panel just yesterday, Takia Thompson, who's a junior at North Carolina Central University, just up the road. She studies political science there. She's an activist. She's originally from Brooklyn, New York. And as you know, not long after the events in Charlottesville, there was activism in Durham, and Takia was central to that activism. Thank you all for being here. Mike, I think I'll start with you because you came to us from Charlottesville. What would we not know about Charlottesville simply from having watched the press coverage? What do we need to know about the city that we wouldn't know from having watched the coverage of what happened?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is a real privilege to be among. This is a very august panel, and it's great to be with you, and it's great to be with all of you. So I think for a lot of us in Charlottesville, this has been very odd, and you captured it well, that all of a sudden we became a hashtag, and I think the meaning of what Charlottesville, of what has happened, is probably going to be worked out for years, not just months. So it's a really good question, because I think the thing that we're all grappling with, locals, is Charlottesville is totally different from this image that has been sort of foisted on us recently. There was a weekly magazine for a number of years called The Hook. The Hook refers to a turn of phrase that we have in Charlottesville, which is something that people just say. It's the hook. You come through to go to school there, and it hooks you and you want to move back because it's such a friendly, interesting, cool, fun, chilled, sweet place where you can sort of be who you want to be. There's something about the culture in Charlottesville that has always been really magical, and a lot of people like reorient their whole lives to come back and live there. So there's that part of Charlottesville, which is one of the reasons, ironically, that I think that we have become the target of so much attention. A lot of people, people don't know it's a 50,000 person city, but it has this outsized reputation. But at the core of Charlottesville is it's a 50,000 person city. You're very likely, a person in this neighborhood is going to know somebody. It's going to be one degree of separation from somebody somewhere else. The other thing about Charlottesville is that even though we've become very progressive in recent years, recent decades, there is a very raw and dark history of systemic racism, of oppression, of violence that you talked about some, and that we are still just coming to grips with in this recent period of sort of political progressivism. You've seen that happen. There are conservative university towns, there are progressive ones. We're a very progressive one. We voted for Bernie Sanders. We got 5 Democrats on city council. It's a progressive place there, and a lot of those values are what are driving a lot of culture and politics in Charlottesville recently. But there was, up until fairly recently, one of the major country clubs in outside of town did not admit diverse members. I've heard stories like you said that in the 50s and 60s, a friend of mine who's African American, who's early 60s, he tells stories about the cultural code was that when you walked when he walked down the sidewalk, and if there was somebody white coming on the sidewalk toward him, he would have to walk on the street. And that was the code when he was a younger person. And so there's those wounds and those experiences, setting aside massive resistance and urban renewal and a whole lot of structural things that really wreaked, harm on a lot of people. We're still combing through them now and surfacing them now and trying to create a living history. So it's been a very dynamic period in Charlottesville. I would say, though, that it's a very progressive place that wanted to start telling the truth about race in the city, and that was one of the things that put a target on the city.
So it's so interesting for me to hear you tell the story of Charlottesville that way. Because I both experienced it in that way and then very much not that way. Jamel, I'm interested in your experience in part as a student, but then also you were there during the, I don't know what to call what happened. I mean, I really don't. I don't. Do we have a word for what happened in August?
I mean, I've been calling it recent events.
Recent. What a nice euphemism. The recent events. Yes.
So I should say I actually fall into the category of people that Mike talked about that moved back to town. So I live in Charlottesville again now. My wife teaches at a elementary school there. And I'll say
You got hooked.
Yeah, I got hooked. It's funny, I had like a very unrepresentative student experience at the University of Virginia. UVA, like a lot of schools, have residential colleges and additional dorms and student apartments. I lived in a residential college. Geared towards international students. I am not an international student. And most people I saw on a daily basis were, or at least like in more intimate confines, were not white, which is just like a not usual thing for someone at the University of Virginia. And so there were spaces at UVA where I encountered, I think the kind of racism that you think you would encounter at UVA, sort of like good old boys, at fraternities, deliberately all white fraternities. Not that I was rushing, but a friend would invite me to a party and it would be like become a thing because it's like, oh, we don't let black people here. But I would always return to this almost like safe space, hashtag safe space, of. Oh, wow. Already? Like 10 minutes in. I mean, you can't really, I mean, it's words like that, right? They have like a plain meaning and they have like the other hashtag meaning. And then you can't really not mention the hashtag meaning. Anyway, so that sort of kind of that space I was in as a resident really mediated my experience at UVA and sort of like, made it, I think, very different than a student of color who like didn't necessarily have that. So I'll say that. As for having been there during recent events, so I was right. The week before I moved, or rather the week after I moved back to Charlottesville, there was the Klan rally. The KKK proper showed up for like a basically 50 dudes in their costumes showed up to like rally in front of the Stonewall Jackson statue next to the courthouse. And Michael attests to this, a ton of people came out. There was 50 of those dudes and a couple thousand citizens who were basically yelling at them and telling them to go, and it was a big thing, and everyone felt very jubilant and triumphant in the aftermath. And my thought in the aftermath of that was that this is actually a very easy thing for a community to do, right? If a guy in a purple Grand Wizard's costume shows up, and that apparently is the costume of a Grand Wizard, purple. It's like a bright.
It's also such a good name, to be like the Imperial Wizard,
right, Imperial Wizard.
Yeah,
there we go.
It's great. It's a great title.
It's like a Grand Moff or something. But so those guys come to your town waving signs about how they don't want, Jews don't belong in Virginia. It's very easy to mobilize against those sorts of people. What's interesting about August 12th was that, from just my perspective, was that it was sort of hard to tell who was part of the Unite the Right gathering and who wasn't. who was coming from outside, but who was just in the community, a member of the community, someone who I wouldn't give a second glance to on the downtown mall or anywhere else, but who turns out is like a virulent white supremacist. And I'll end that point with this remarkable video that I saw from Unite the Right. And it was I think it was Unite the Right, maybe it was somewhere else. It may have been in Boston, but I think it was Unite the Right. It was a young white guy who was part of the marchers, and he had his sort of gear on, and he was trying to flee counter-protesters. And he took off his shirt, and all of a sudden, he was like indistinguishable from any other white person there. And I find that so crazy. It's so crazy to me that you could do that someone could do that. I can't. If I'm walking around some Tony exclusive white neighborhood, I can't like take off my skin. I'm still a black dude hanging out there. But this guy took off his identifying clothing and all of a sudden blended in. And I think in that there is something about how the kind of hatred and prejudice we saw Unite the Right that seems to be bubbling up doesn't just exist hidden and silent and disguisable in a place like Charlottesville, but everywhere.
So I guess, I want to push on this a little bit. So I feel like you think I was trolling you for, tell me your racism UVA stories. Yeah, no, right, but I want to be clear. I wasn't trolling you for them. Like, I wasn't asking you to be like, tell me about the mean white people in Charlottesville. Because Michael, part of what I found interesting about how you responded to this moment in your writing was, you were like, dude, just FYI, Trump is kind of ridiculous, but the one thing that he says that was interesting, even in its ridiculousness, was to call people whack losers. Yeah. And so maybe instead of taking these folks real seriously, we ought to just sort of push back, shrug.
Yeah, what I was recalling was after the bombing in Manchester, England, Trump, in his very Trumpian way, said something unpresidential but almost appropriate for the way it was unpresidential, which he said, I don't want to call them monsters, they would probably like that, they're hateful losers. And I was troubled that, I'm troubled a lot of things about Trump, but I remember after Charlottesville wishing, why couldn't he call them hateful losers? Why couldn't he pull them down a peg? Because in a way the imagery that they presented, that Unite the Right presented, was meant to be menacing, right? The very fact of not wearing masks was what was meant to be menacing in exactly the way that Jamel identified, that in a sense that as soon as we are put down the torches, you won't be able to recognize most of us. We are around you. And there's an element here where there are ridiculous aspects to these specific people. Two of the 5 organizers of Unite the Right have no connection to the South at all. They're anti-Semitic podcasters from New York and New Hampshire. In a way, they are. Thank you for saying that. They are in a way. No, I mean seriously, like the extent to which people are like, oh my God, the South needs to get itself, and I'm like, actually, New York could feel free to get itself. This is right, and in a way, we're. If you looked even at the imagery that Unite the Right put out, the General Lee statue was not central to their imagery. They were drawing on far-right imagery from Europe, and in a way, a way that you may find bizarre, they were appropriating lost causism from the South that doesn't belong to them in any way. They were trying to attach their more modern or esoteric fascist views or views about a pan-white racialism that are mostly foreign to Southern apologists for the historic Confederate cause, and attach it to something that had a deeper resonance in America. And that was the thing I wish that Trump or someone could have pulled them down, because one of the distressing things about this is I knew Richard Spencer 10 years ago. He worked in the same office as I did for 8 months before he was fired. He wasn't what he was now, but he was trying to be a conservative of some kind. Now he's trying to be something else, but he is a snotty dork from Dallas. And we had this 18 months.
Hashtag snotty dork from Dallas.
And I had known him as this person with kind of esoteric and weird views about Friedrich Nietzsche, and there was something silly about him. And yet for 18 months I had watched the media kind of play into his own vanity and ego as this idea of, I'm this wave of the future, I am this monster that is coming for you. And I just was, I wanted people to pull him down, but of course the reality is they went to Charlottesville and became monsters. I mean, there were casualties.
So I'm going to let you in 1 second, Rashad, but I know what happens. So just pause 1 second. Because I think how you ended is important. I think part of the reason we don't just shrug is because for many people, for almost everyone, experiencing it, seeing it, watching it, it's not only appalling, it is legitimately terrifying. And part of the terror is Heather Heyer's death. It's not exclusively the reason, but it certainly is the bloody exclamation point on how far this can go. And so I know that all of us as faculty, as student affairs professionals, when something like this happens in August, as we're preparing for our students to return, like there's this, we're calling each other, we're texting each other, our stomachs are tightening. So you're a student on a campus. If you did your action in Durham and you're from New York, it must have meant you were back on campus?
I live in North Carolina now.
You're
I've been in North Carolina for about the past 5 years now. So I've been around NC politics the whole time.
So tell me what it was that you saw happen in this moment. So I know you've been an activist or engaged in a wide variety of justice issues around class and race. What was it in this moment that activated you to decide to act along with others in your community around the Confederate monument in Durham?
So specifically, you want me to speak to how Charlottesville okay. Well, like I've said before, that I see no difference between Charlottesville and anywhere America, because what happened in Charlottesville, if we look throughout history, like Charlottesville has happened in Durham already. Charlottesville has happened in Philadelphia. Charlottesville has happened in Kansas, right? It just keeps reiterating itself. And I think when you make those historical links, you see the vulnerability of anywhere, right? And I think that I was able to do that.
Was it? So you're the first person arrested in Durham?
Right.
Being arrested right now is a pretty high stakes endeavor for a young woman of color. It's a monument. It's a statue. Why does it matter?
Well, I kind of made the connection between this side of the statue really spoke to me because this side of the statue says, "To the boys who wore the gray," because it's a generic monument to the Confederacy. And today I see no ideological difference between the boys in gray and the boys in blue, right? Cogs in a system that continue the subjugation of Black people and other oppressed people in this country. And I think those, like, the Civil War struggle is directly related to the police state and the situation of mass incarceration in this country. And it's a very clear connection, right, in my mind.
Say more.
Okay, so I feel like these systems of like capitalist exploitation and subjugation just keep reiterating themselves, right? After slavery, it was peonage, then was convict leasing, then was like tenant farming, right? So it's just a system where instead of like paying you in like a pound of pig meat every week, we're gonna pay you 12 cents in prison, right? To do all of these things that enrich the elites, right? We're gonna have inmates selling Idaho potatoes, right? We're gonna have inmates pressing your license plates, making $6 an hour. In California, we're gonna have female firefighters getting paid $1 an hour who are now barred from being firefighters and bettering their lives after they're released from prison, right? It's just a system of exploitation that keeps sanitizing itself, right?
So, Rashad, I see you nodding, and this is a little bit of a setup. This is a little bit of a slow pitch across the middle for you, because Color of Change is a response to Charlottesville, and I feel like when folks watch it, they go, oh my God, this terrible thing is happening, I want to do something. We're in the midst of a different kind of crisis right now. Harvey is happening, Irma's bearing down. People feel like, okay, a disaster is happening, and it's charitable. And when a terrible thing that's charitable is happening, I'm going to give money. But what do I do about racism? I mean, that shit's old and long and bad, and so I'll just be not racist. But Color of Change was like, oh, I know, PayPal, suckers. What in the world does PayPal and Visa and MasterCard have to do with Charlottesville?
So I'm going to back up just quickly to actually
please, sir.
say how it happens. So we, just our model at Color of Change, we are constantly not just responding to moments, but trying to find a systemic pivot. The thing that by channeling people's energy and engagement, we can actually make real change. And it goes right back to our founding, which was really 12 years ago right now in the aftermath of Katrina, when Black people were on their roofs begging for the government to do something and being left to die. And it illustrated so many things that we knew about geographic segregation and generational poverty and what we've done to a whole lot of systems. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. The media, corporations, government. And so people were giving to the Red Cross and then stopping there, and not building any type of infrastructure to make people's lives better or to stop the problem. So we have a interesting relationship with the growing white supremacist movement in this country. The right infrastructure has been so successful at using secretive online tools and not so secretive online tools. There are platforms like Breitbart and others which speak in codes and use symbols to sort of gin up anger and frustration, gin up falsehoods. So you can take a poll of how many people believe President Obama was born in the United States, and you still see numbers that would surprise you, and you're like, how do people know that? It's because people are only getting their media from one place and are hearing one side of the story. So during the lead up to the Republican convention, we ran this campaign to force corporations to make a choice about a relationship with the Black community or a relationship with Donald Trump. And many corporations backed out of the RNC convention because of our campaign. We got about $10 million of divestment, and we also started getting attacked by white supremacist sites. Our address got put on Stormfront. My home address got put out there. We had to hire the security director from the Southern Poverty Law Center to come in. We do not have Southern Poverty Law Center's endowment, so it was like it was not sort of like an easy lift. But we also started looking at these sites very closely in the process. And as you went to sites where you could buy gun paraphernalia intended to help you shoot Muslims, literally, you could pay for it through PayPal. You could put your MasterCard in there and buy it and have it shipped to you. And I was like, no, no. And so we started a campaign back in February. We reached out to all of these, to PayPal, Apple Pay, the 4 major credit card companies, and we started a conversation with them. We listed 100 sites that they should remove. We went back and forth with these companies behind the scenes. PayPal, actually, to their credit, and Apple Pay started removing sites before Charlottesville. Many of these credit card companies would say, we share your values. I mean, they did it in writing, so we have it. We share your values, but there's nothing we can do. Some of them would say, actually, it's the banks. We'd go back and forth about who was the problem. We got lawyers involved to actually walk them through that they could actually do it. Charlottesville happens. We had already had all the infrastructure laid. We had a website. We were waiting to figure out what was the moment that we were going to sort of go public, and we weren't actually fully ready when Charlottesville happened, but we were trying to dot all our I's and cross all of our T's and have all the necessary conversations. Charlottesville happened. We go live. Within about 72 hours, somehow, it was legal for MasterCard to somehow cut off these organizations. Somehow it was no longer the banks for Visa. And these companies started removing sites as quickly as we could sort of name them. PayPal removed most of the sites we asked. Apple Pay, down the line, started removing these sites. But it was, for us, when people are seeing what's happening on their TV, or on the internet, or in the world, how do you translate the presence of an issue, the awareness, people paying attention, people talking about it, into the power to actually change the rules? And in the process, we know, just because we've still get a lot of contact from white supremacist sites, that it has made it very tough for them to raise money the way they were raising money before. And how we hold corporations, how we hold institutions that occupy sort of a mainstream space accountable for their behavior in this moment is incredibly important for us to be able to set a standard for how society should behave.
All right, so we're going to go into the rapid fire round. And so what I'm going to do is I've got a few things where I've chosen some slightly more provocative. I'm just going to kind of push it a little bit. So here we go. Michael, here's my just slightly provocative. I mean, literally, just slightly. I'm just sort of interested in this because you wrote this, and so I'm fascinated by this. So we just heard from Rashad that in part, the violence in Charlottesville provides this opening for strategy and movement building. You wrote, in part, that the white supremacists were looking for violence against them as a strategic tool, right? So part of what you wrote was they were looking for footage of people beating them up. Say more.
Yeah, so in the conservative world in which I move, in conservative media, one of the recent obsessions lately has been violence against conservative speakers on campus, or not even just violence, just pranks or disruption. Some of that attention has also gone to groups like Antifa, the black-clad anti-fascist, street brawlers who go out and want to bust up white supremacist rallies, but maybe want to bust up events that are held by people that fit a more expanded definition of white supremacy. some conservative speakers have gone around and, have been poisoned at events in like Reykjavik in the past year. And so there's this fear of Antifa. And what happened is the actual fascists saw this as a potential day where they could grab footage and then leverage the kind of mainstream conservative fear of Antifa into support for fascists who normally are dismissed with a wave of a hand. They did not get that day. What they got the exact opposite, which is footage of them, footage of one of their number engaging in a style of terror attack that is associated with radical jihadism in Europe. But that was the kind of lever that they are using, is that they want to polarize the environment further. They want to encourage Antifa to not only attack them, but attack people like me in order to create a cleaner split. And I would bet on almost anything for them to try this more in the future. Right? I mean, it is one of the weirdest things to look at with a little perspective, to see in Berkeley, California, or in other places, hundreds of people lining up on different sides of the street with a weapon in one hand and their camera phone in the other. And they're trying to create these moments, they've been successful in the past. I mean, they tried to make a folk hero out of a man, I think his name is Kyle Chapman, who they call Based Stick Man. Because he, wore a shield and a helmet and beat someone over the head with a stick. I think that style of political theater, is something that's going to be a huge trend in the next 2 years or beyond.
Jamel, I think the argument that Confederate statues should come down because of racism is misguided, and we should stop making it.
I mean, say more.
So I think if we start raising buildings, statues, memorials, based on the racists, then it's all going down.
Right.
This is rubble. Yeah. So that we should have more conceptual clarity, right? That the problem with the Confederates is that they're traitors who lost a war. They're basically like the frickin' Falcons into Super Bowl last year. You don't see nobody wearing no damn Falcon shirt. They suck. They're losers. Well, they're garbage ass losers who tried to leave the country and then they frickin' lost, and so they don't. Who is wearing a damn garbage ass Falcons big ass failure?
Well,
no, but I'm sorry.
So what's funny,
I'm a Saints fan. So you see, I'm sorry. Everybody who's from Atlanta, y'all lost. And so no one is wearing your stinking jersey. And so the conceptual clarity point is that they were treasonous traitors. And I don't really care if they were fighting for olive oil and peanuts. It's not really about racism, because if it's racism, everybody's got to go.
All right. So I will say
all of them.
What is funny about your analogy?
The chapel is coming down. I like the chapel a lot.
I'll just say real quick, what's funny about your analogy, right?
The house I live in has got to go. Probably yours too.
Yeah, probably. So the losing Super Bowl team, their gear, goes to impoverished countries, kind of just given away.
Sir, you want to send the Lee statue to an impoverished?
No. This is going somewhere. After the Civil War, there were a group of Confederates who went to rural Brazil to set up a colony where they could pretend to be the victors. I'm just saying.
Stop it! Why do you know that?
It's just like a funny thing where you're not.
And then what did they do?
Yeah. They still.
Oh no, I saw that.
Yeah. It's the weirdest thing in the world.
What? There's like a random website where they have like the whole yeah, and they have like the stars and bars, and oh God.
So no, I think you're right. I mean, I've always been.
And then they also pretended to win all throughout South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think to say that, and in watching the conversations post Charlottesville about monuments unfold, and I think they're all very valuable and good. I've seen claims to the effect of, well, from people who are skeptical about taking down Confederate monuments for any reason. Well, why don't we take down statues of Thomas Jefferson? Why don't we take down statues of George Washington? And if racism is your criteria here, then that's actually a totally fair point, right? Thomas Jefferson, famous slaveholder. George Washington may have had dentures made from the teeth of his enslaved people. I mean, this was gruesome stuff, and these people did terrible things. And there's no further time excuse here. There are people at those times who recognized that what was happening was wrong. Jefferson himself being one of them, and one of his many sort of quirky things about him. Quirky is a bad word. So I think your criteria here that they were traitors is important, but I don't think one should excise racism from it either. You gave us sort of a little printout of your slides, and in that printout you have a graph showing when Confederate monuments were erected, and they were erected basically in three periods. They were erected in the 1870s and 80s, they're erected in the 1910s and 20s, and they're erected in the 1950s and 60s. And those are also the periods of white backlash and sort of the reification of white supremacy, redemption in the 1880s and 70s, what's called the nadir in the 1910s, 1920s, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Kind of America becomes dramatically more racist in ways that are kind of actually a little hard to even fathom. And then obviously the civil rights movement and the reaction to it. And I think that history is really vital to the public conversation about why I mean, and this is where I stand, why I think Confederate monuments ought to come down, because they were placed not as historical markers, not even really as objects of historical memory, but as essentially markers of domination. That we're putting the statue of Robert E. Lee by the courthouse in this major public field to say this belongs to us, not to you. And if that's the case, that's not true for your Washingtons and your Jeffersons. And there's a separate argument about how, and you made this point in your introduction, that Jefferson is someone who there's good to extract from. There is aspirational things to extract from at the same time that we recognize his wrongdoing, same with Washington, same with sort of many of our revered American figures. But in this particular case, not only was the cause for which these men fought for evil, not only were they traitors, but the whole reason those monuments exist is to signal that this is a white man's country and it doesn't belong to you. And if that's true, and it is, then you have to.
I like how you judge your own argument, and you're like, and I'm right.
Yeah, I mean.
Yes, good.
But those are ticks that my editors kind of just nip. But if that's the case, then you can't. Not only can you not leave these monuments up, but leaving them up sends that continued message that people understand that message. I think it's totally true that your Richard Spencers came to Charlottesville because of the kind of places, the kind of sort of cosmopolitan and open-minded place it is. But it's also true that I think they recognize the symbology of a Robert E. Lee monument and a Stonewall Jackson monument. They correctly understand what it means. So you gotta tear them down.
Mike, here's my provocation for you. When I'm listening to some of what I hear, both the people of Charlottesville, but not exclusively the folks of Charlottesville, but sometimes a little bit the people of Charlottesville. What I remember as a kid in part was the T-shirts that said, "All dirt roads lead to tech." Yeah, Virginia Tech. People are like, what? Huh? Right, okay. So I can remember when President Obama was president. Let's just all sit there. Okay. But when President Obama was president, he used to do a thing that really irritated black communities. He would, he'd be in the middle of a speech, his fine speech or something, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, Cousin Pookie." And people, "Oh, good Lord, are we gonna Cousin Pookie now?" And it was this kind of respectability politics in which he would perform something that actually ministers perform and parents perform, where in order to make an argument about right behavior, he would use a socially constructed trope of a person who doesn't actually exist, right? Cousin Pookie, who does bad things and shames the race through bad behavior. As I watched some of the Charlottesville reactions to what happened in recent events, and I thought about those "all dirt roads lead to tech" t-shirts of my childhood, and I remembered the polite racism that my family often experienced, I wondered if the problem was less about racism or white supremacy and more about a kind of white respectability politics that was going on, a sort of, y'all better carry that shit to tech, hope. That ain't how we do it in Charlottesville. Now, we can be racist, but we ain't gonna be wandering around here with no tiki torches and cutting up like this. This is not how, no sir, not around here. You can take that to Blacksburg, but no sir, not on the grounds. Because if that's what it is, if this becomes the easiest thing to do, to simply say, "Oh, well, I'm not that kind of racist. I mean, I'm not wearing a purple hood or, running my car into people. I mean, good, please don't." But that is, as Jamal wrote, that is such a low bar, right? That is so, I want to be sure that we are grappling with, man, did we give birth to that with our daily insidious versions of white supremacy that show up in our very polite behaviors? Because I worry that is the far more difficult thing to root out.
What you said?
No, so part of what I'm asking is, so how do we do that when we are polite to each other? And it's harder.
So there's I have sort of a side hustle as a political scientist. That was my background before I became a lawyer, and there was a political scientist named V.O. Key who did a study of all the different American states, and he compared the different states. And when he analyzed Virginia, he talked about its conservative gentility. He was writing, I believe, in the middle of the century, and he was, it was sort of like anthropology, looking at the different states culturally. And it is, I think you're on to something that and I don't know, but the distinction, I taught at Virginia Tech for a lot of years, so I'm split.
I'm being hard on Tech.
I'm a who and I'm a Hokie.
They're a great school.
But I think there was a culture Virginia has changed a lot in recent years. I mean, it in part has to do with the urban crescent, so it goes from Northern Virginia to Richmond to Hampton Roads. A lot of federal spending, a lot of diversity is coming to Virginia, a lot of innovation. So you have a very dynamic Commonwealth that is different from what it was 30, 50 years ago. But what you're talking about was that sort of very oppressive, very conservative, quiet, sort of coercive set of cultural habits, which was Virginian. And you can see it in the way that Faulkner wrote about the first families of Virginia. You can see it in a lot of UVA traditions when people who went there, especially longer ago, but even now you still see it some with the way that people talk about it. So one of the challenges I think that you're talking about is how do those people who benefit or are sitting on top of that quiet, oppressive, conservative structure, how do they become more woke about it? How do they recognize the privilege? How do they disrupt it in some way? And I think that's one of the things that's happening right now, kind of around Virginia. It's definitely happening in Charlottesville. As from things like city council meetings to community meetings to neighborhood meetings to conversations that are happening on street corners, I think there's like a raw quality to it that is at, long last kind of opening it up. There was a real, this week, there's this, Brian Stevenson has the Equal Justice Initiative, and his whole goal with this is to open up the history of lynching in the country. And he likens it to South Africa or Germany, really, bringing their past into the present in a way that alters your future, and it alters you. And that's what truth does. And so that just happened this week in Charlottesville. There is a recorded lynching which happened, and there was going to be a monument, and it's going to, the city's going to join with the Equal Justice Initiative and this museum that's going to be in Alabama, which is an extraordinary museum, the way that's designed, and it's really meant to disrupt your present and make you deal with the past differently. I think I wanted to pivot and just talk about one other thing that was coming up here, which is related to this, which the alt-right, the way that they seized on this statue and what it came to represent to them was as diverse as we were hearing here. So actually in the court filings that were battling back and forth beforehand, there was a whole question about, was there a nexus between the Lee statue and protests about the statue staying, because a lot of the literature and all the online propaganda about this event had to do with like European immigration. It had to do with stuff that had very little to do with whether this Confederate statue was staying, and that goes to what Michael is talking about, which is it really did become a proxy for a whole lot of other, I think pretty evil ideas, and a lot of people who were damaged and really want to, the way in which they're damaged, they want to take it out in a malevolent way on other people, which is unacceptable. And so I think that one of the reasons that there's so much movement now around that attempt is because it's a response to these people really trying to hurt other people.
Let me get questions in for these last two, and then I'm out. Rashad, here's my provocation for you. Turns out President Trump is damn good for moving race in America, because check it out. Look, we get President Trump, mayors start taking down Confederate statues in the middle of the night. Republicans show up on TV talking about white supremacy is wrong in hordes. I mean, I'm sorry. I had not really for a decade seen white folks even use the word white supremacy in contemporary context, and Republicans showed up like, white supremacy is wrong. How dare you act like it is not, sir? We have shown up to say together, linking arms, the Republican Party, that white supremacy is wrong. I was like, they keep this up, we're about to be free by like 2022. You talk about you against PayPal. I wrote a check for Mr. Trump's reelection. So here's my provocative question: is Mr. Trump what we needed all along to move the needle on race in America? Forget this Obama mess.
I don't think we would have gotten Trump without Obama.
Well, clearly.
So first and foremost.
Right. Oh, so we needed Obama to get us Trump. So what? So next we get a queer black woman.
It's
not like that. It's next. That's what's
all of my prediction juice is out the window. So I'm not. I
predicted Trump.
So what I will say is what worries me about this moment, and we are, since since Charleston, we have been building campaigns with local communities around removing statues and working very closely. It's not been a top-down. We've opened up our platform for local groups to run those campaigns on our platform, and they've been built by organizers on the ground. What I worry about in all of this is that the mayor of Baltimore can remove the statues in the middle of the night, but there's still Confederates in her police department, and they are not removed. And so it's not an either or. It's just that, symbols are in the way that Republicans use symbols to not just mobilize their base to deal with the symbol, but to then pivot to the strategic and systemic issues that actually put us all in harm's way. We
Democrats
oftentimes
have been known to do it too.
Yeah, we stop at the symbols too often. And so my hope is that as people are being on-ramped and as multiracial coalitions are working to remove the symbols of our past that have been oppressive, that they are actually dealing with the structural issues that are still in place, and we are changing the policies and the practices that hold people back, not just removing statues. We remove the statues, but we actually have to remove the structures that put people in harm's way. We have to change the rules. Sometimes they're written, sometimes they're unwritten. But if we're not changing the rules, then we're not doing the work. And so removing statues is important, but in each of these cities where we remove the statues, there's nothing that's been done to challenge FOP about protecting a set of police officers in their cities. There's not been anything done about dealing with this sort of disastrous way that we fund public education, or not at the level. And how do we make the same fire and passion and energy that we have around these statues around those issues? Yep.
And so, since you were the first person to make the link for us, I'm going to ask you exactly that. I'm going to give you the final on this. So I asked you backstage to think about, let's say there was something that made it impossible to remove any of the statues that exist, but I was going to give you a budget that said where every single existing Confederate statue currently stands, you can go, because I like Jamel's point that these statues say this space is not for you. So where each of these statues stand, we're going to raise another statue next to it. So who are some of the statues, or whether they are of individuals or of collectives or of ideas, what are some of the other statues that we want to see raised next to them? And then maybe also on Rashad's point, and I'll bring that question down the line, but also on Rashad's point, as we're thinking about the symbols, since you also made the link earlier between the symbols and the public policy, if there are crucial public policies that are on your agenda as well.
To address your first question about removing statues and having a budget to build new statues, well, you said it was $10 million? Well, it don't take $10 million to remove a Confederate statue. You know what I'm saying? It just needs 4 materials, really: a rope, a ladder, some people, and some willpower to remove some statues. So with the $10 million, I would create a reparations package. You know what I'm saying? I would save that money and just create a reparations package. As far as policy goes, to transform these institutions, I don't think you could reform white supremacy, right? Because it's just going to reiterate itself. You can't transform white supremacy. You can't transform a system that wants to keep a class of people oppressed so that you can suppress their wages and increase your profits. You can't change that, right? You just got to get rid of it, right? So I can't really think, but I mean practically, right? Because, the revolution is not going to happen tomorrow, right? But practically, people need a jacket from the cold, harsh conditions of capitalism, right? So I think funding schools, right? Because we talk about violence a lot, but I think the conversation always tends to go to the physical violence, but subprime lending is violent. defunding schools is violent. Having police, with guns around kids, right? Body slamming kids is violent, right? So yeah, I would transform the hidden violence within the system.
Shad, who's your monument to? If you could build monuments next to the Confederates, who'd stand next to them?
Ella Baker.
Yes, ma'am.
Ella Baker.
I'd say I do agree with Ella Baker. I'd say Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes.
I would say the SNCC organizers who sat at lunch counters.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else want to make suggestions? I'll take suggestions from the audience too for, we'll put a Sojourner Truth up, all right? Give me again. Marsha P. Johnson, yes. Bree Newsome. Ooh, we'll put an Ida up, yes.
This crowd is too woke for me.
No, I really, I want General Lee to have to look at Ida for the rest of his, eternity. I'm down for that.
How about the U.S. colored troops?
Oh, yes. They should have to face the colored troops for just like all of eternity.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, we could retake public space in some interesting ways here, right? That'd be one thing. Yeah, Michael.
Just the idea of juxtaposition, I thought it'd be an interesting pivot. The last time I was at an event where a Stars and Bars Confederate flag was waved, I was in Thurles, Ireland, in a hurling match, a local hurling match. And the club was the Cork, and Cork was known as the Rebels. And so Cork fans had adopted the Confederate flag. And when I saw the Confederate flag, there was one man flying it, one flagpole. On the bottom was the Confederate Stars and Bars, and then above it was another red flag with Che Guevara's face on it.
Why?
And so, what I think it illustrates, first of all, it's like one of these images where you're in Ireland, and then I'm thinking this would basically blow everyone's minds back home if I tried to explain these two symbols next to each other. But I do think it illustrated to me a point that I feel obligated to speak up for, which is that many people look at Confederate symbols and they were habituated to them and educated in them in a way that is not the way, as Jamel explained, that these symbols and monuments were put up as markers of white supremacy. In some ways, for many people, these symbols have been whitewashed. I mean, they grew up like I did watching Ken Burns' Civil War, where Shelby Foote is brought on, and almost all he talks about is, the dignity and stoicism and sacrifice of Confederate soldiers who didn't own slaves, who never would own slaves. They have this view of these symbols that is not been charged. They are not woke. They are not habituated to a language of that is as elevated as
I'd
we
actually
are
say
here.
that's even more elevated. That I thought you were going to say they just grew up with like Bo and Luke Duke and General Lee. Like, I mean, like you went real like, I mean, like I can remember my father being like, I dare you to put your hand on that and try to buy it in the store. But like, it was, it was on TV. I was like, oh, it's Bo and Luke Duke and that's a car. And it's got the, that's the General Lee. I'm old. She's looking at me like, ma'am, you're 100. Yes, I am. But like, that was just like the TV show that they showed us. And so that was the thing. And so it was a habituated thing, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not deeply problematic.
Oh, no.
Right.
Listen, I'm not saying it's not problematic or that the symbol doesn't have real legible meaning. What I'm saying is when you confront the symbol, often you are confronting a constructed level of innocence about what it means. and that people have, well-intentioned people have tried to retrieve these symbols, and even when they were put up, there was a dialogue about white supremacy in the South, but there was also genuine humiliation of having been a defeated region, being economically a third world country compared to the rest of the country, and there was this conscious effort to try to give the South some dignity. Well, maybe there's dignity in defeat, or in defeat and being peaceful afterwards. This is a mythology that existed for multiple reasons, some of them deeply malevolent and some of them just human.
It's so man, Michael, we got to like the good stuff at the end. Cause see, there you go. Yep. And then, like, my little black Southerner just jumps up on the inside and is like, absolutely, so true. I believe you. And no one cared about that same set of human experiences for the other human beings that were standing there. And so I think that the difficulty, right? So what you're asking for, what you're asking for is empathy. No.
A little bit.
Yeah. You're asking for empathy. You're saying, look at the human condition that is complicated and difficult across history. Understand that it comes across the space. Understand that people are engaged in a set of practices that end up badly, even though they're acting without malevolent purpose. And I think, like, my teacher self, my human self, my Unitarian Universalist, love self wants to, when Thomas Jefferson wants to jump up and provide empathy. The great-great-granddaughter of the woman sold on the street corner holds that empathy back, in part in historical acknowledgement of the lack of empathy ever shown to her. In order to say, it is so frequently required of us that Dylan Roof's murder of the 9 in Charleston did not turn into a race war is for one reason only, because those 9 families did something that they should never have had to do. They stood there the next morning and said, "We forgive." My God. And which, by the way, is in fact unthinkable flipped racially. Is in fact actually historically and any contemporary moment completely unthinkable. And so the gift of empathy of black folks to white folks throughout almost all of Southern history is so common that it's just so hard to give. And so I guess part of what I'm asking for is empathy on the other side, to say, yeah, I hear you and I actually get it. And I even, like, my first impulse, and I often encourage my students and they look at me like, MHP, we are so sick of you. Wake this vote. And it probably is the work we will keep doing. But it's part of why, like, I always enjoy Rashad. Rashad's like he's like my angry friend on my shoulder. It's like, bring Rashad, so all of things I don't say. Fuck my pal. So I just wanted to give voice to that like, there's a part of me that has to stand up for Grandma Rosa and say, nah, dog, no. I don't care. I don't care if y'all lost and felt bad about it. So what? I don't care. And at the same time wants to say, it's our country, it's our school, it's our university, it's our community, and so I do care. And we have to extend some level of understanding and reach and conversation to each other. But I will ask that as we do it, that there is an acknowledgement that across history, so frequently, that empathy has been extended from those who have less to those who have more. And to just, I know that we so frequently have difficulty talking across those divides. It really is hard work. But when we go at the end of today into our sessions, Chizoba, thank you so much for helping to put these together. Student government, thank you for helping us put these together. We're going to go and start these conversations in our community. We're going to have these conversations. So let me just say, I had a little moment of like, nah, I want to talk to you, but I do want to talk to you. I want to keep talking to you. The Pro Humanitate Institute will keep talking to you. And in fact, please put it on your calendars. I hope you have saved the dates. That is called Rethinking Community. This was the very first Rethinking Community event. We will continue to rethink community together, and we're going to have a 2-day event where the Pro Humanitate Institute is going to come together with our colleagues from the EI Institute. We are bringing speakers and student groups and folks from all across the country for 2.5 days of events and programming where we are going to think about all the big issues from hashtag safe spaces to hashtag free speech. We're going to talk about every single thing that you can imagine that is hard to talk about. And we're going to try to be as courageous as we can be, as honest as we can be. And we're going to talk about what community is and whether or not we can move forward together as a community. I appreciate so much that you all took the time to come out. I appreciate our entire panel for taking the time to join us this evening. I thank everybody on live stream for hanging out with us tonight on live stream. Thank you to the Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Piedmont community and the Wake Forest University community for being here this evening.